Good morning, everybody. My name is Bart Hilhorst, and I've been working in the Nile Basin for many, many years. I've been involved in the production of the Nile State Basin Report 2012, and also in the newest version, the 2020 version. And I think I must have met many, many of you. Today, we're going to talk about the state of food security in the Nile Basin and the need for improving agricultural water productivity. So when you look at food security in the Nile Basin, you see a mixed picture, but also a disturbing picture. So when we look at, for instance, the prevalence of undernourishment, which is presented in this figure here, we see that things are more or less okay in Egypt, things are improving in Ethiopia, things are pretty much stable in Sudan and Tanzania, but the situation is slowly getting worse in a number of countries, such as Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. And what this implies is that the increase in food production, together with imports, cannot keep up with a growing population. And this is reflected also in the average daily calorie intake per capita in the Nile countries. You know that there is a rule of thumb that if you have 3,000 kilocalories per capita per day, then there is no famine in a country. Now, most countries, actually all Nile countries, are below this threshold, apart from Egypt. And because we expect a large increase of demand for food because of population growth and economic development, it is pretty clear that food security remains a critical concern for governments. Now, it is often suggested that agriculture trade within the Nile Basin could provide food security in the Nile countries. But I don't think that it's that easy. The reason for that is that all Nile countries are currently net food importers, and none is on track to become a consistent surplus producer in the short or even midterm future. The country that is closest to achieve this status is obviously Sudan, but also there it will take a while. And even if Sudan becomes a consistent surplus producer, it will be very difficult to ship agricultural produce to the Upper Nile countries because of the absence of infrastructure for bulk transport. Moreover, many of the Nile countries are characterized by a large rural population, and that is a situation that will persist for a number of years, for many of them even until 2040, 2050. And these people simply cannot afford food imports. What it means is that food security in the upper basin countries will be largely based on domestic and sub-regional production. This development of large-scale irrigation solution, but that doesn't look too good, and that is because we simply do not have the water. The NBI analyzed a large set of irrigation development scenarios with parameters such as future climate, irrigation efficiencies, area expansion, and water deficits occurred in each and every one of these scenarios. And what it means is that expansion of large-scale irrigation on its own is not the magic bullet. It implies that improvements across all farming systems are needed in combination with food imports, in particular for the urban population. So now let's have a look at the livestock sector. Pastoralist farming system is in fact the most prevailing farming system in the Nile Basin, and it's very good to make productive use of the rainfall in this zone up to 400 millimeters per year, the arid and semi-arid zone. It represents a huge volume of water, but this is in effect low value water because it can not be used for other agricultural purposes. And livestock is very good. The pastoralist system is very good to make good use of this water. Now, livestock productivity is low, and that means that there is high potential for improvement. And what is important is that these improvements are mostly related to animal management strategies. So not so much to improved land and water management. I think the key message here is that livestock sector should not be ignored, which is often the case. It's very important for food security, and improvements are possible, very well possible, without claiming a lot of water. And I think this is very important. So let's now go to rain-fed farming. And it's important to realize that rain-fed farming comprises 87% of arable land. So it's the dominant farming system when it comes to cultivation. We just said that the total area for the pastoralist systems is larger, but in terms of production, rain-fed farming is the largest farming system in the Nile Basin. And when it comes to rain-fed farming, there are effectively two variables. One is land, and the other one is yield. Now, in the Nile Basin, most prime agricultural land is being used. So for most countries, if you want to expand the total area, you have to go to the marginal lands, you have to encroach wetlands, and it's even that some of the good arable land is being lost to urbanization. Now, there are exceptions. I think it's still possible, very well possible, to expand arable land in South Sudan and Ethiopia, possibly also in Sudan, but grosso modo, area expansion is not the appropriate strategy to achieve food security. If we want to increase the production of rain-fed farming, we have to start looking at yields. And I think this brings us to maybe the most striking feature of agriculture in the Nile Basin, and that is the very large yield gap in rain-fed farming. Now, take for instance maize. Yields are 1 ton per hectare, 1.5 ton per hectare, maybe 2 tons per hectare. And this is everywhere in rain-fed farming systems across the Nile Basin. So also in areas with quite substantial rainfall, 800 millimeters per year, 1,000 millimeters per year, 1,200 millimeters per year, even more, you will find these low yields almost everywhere. And it represents very large untapped agricultural potential. So if you have these low yields and you can double them or even a little bit more, you can just imagine how much more production we would have. And this is important because improving these yields in these underperforming farming systems is one, key to achieving food security, but also very important for rural development and for agricultural modernization. And I think this is quite possible. So improving these underperforming rain-fed farming systems is quite possible. It is very difficult, but it's possible. And maybe the most important thing for the Nile system is that it doesn't require too much extra water. And if you would like to increase the yield in rain-fed farming, you need to provide secure water supply. And this is particularly in the tropics with these very high evapotranspiration rates. Now, when we look at the rain-fed farming areas in the Nile Basin, we typically have quite substantial rainfall, as we just discussed in the previous slide. But we also have high temporal variability of rainfall, both within the season, but also from year to year. And it's this variability that leads to occasional moisture deficits at critical points for plant growth. So you have these 2-week, 3-week periods without rainfall that cause this moisture deficit that leads to crop failure. And it's this high risk of crop failure, which just happens every other year or every third year or so, that makes farmers unwilling to go for improved seeds, to invest in fertilizer and other agricultural inputs, which are required for these higher yields, which are very well possible. And because of that, we are stuck with these low yields, 1-2 tons per hectare. Now, we looked into this and we found that the moisture deficits that lead to this crop failure are typically small. In all cases, it was less than 100 millimeter, and often it was even smaller, 50 millimeters, 60 millimeters. So, with a relatively small volume of water, if you could provide these 50, 60 millimeters of water, you could provide secure water supply for the crops that would encourage farmers to invest in these agricultural inputs that could lead to very substantial higher yields. And a practical way to achieve this secure water supply is supplementary irrigation. We need to realize that rain-fed farming in the Nile Basin mostly concerns smallholders, so we need to keep things simple. And small-scale supplementary irrigation is a very practical way for smallholders to prevent these moisture deficits that lead to occasional crop failure. Since the volumes are small, so maybe 60 millimeters per crop per season, the water for the supplementary irrigation can be supplied by shallow groundwater or water harvested or even small streams. And best is to combine this with improved soil management so that we can increase the moisture storage capacity. We reduce evapotranspiration through creating microclimates, and we use cover crops to further reduce evapotranspiration and to increase the soil moisture storage capacity. Now, because there is quite substantial rainfall in the rain-fed zone in the Nile Basin, often more than 1,000 millimeters per year, the supplementary irrigation, which is maybe from 50 to 100 millimeters per season, primarily extends the productivity of rainfall. So most of the water for the crop is provided by rainfall. Supplementary irrigation serves to provide secure water supply. And the best thing is that it doesn't really affect Nile flows. In large parts of the Nile Basin, we have a low run coefficient, sometimes around 4%, which means that most of the rainfall, 96%, doesn't reach the river system. So if we make a bit better use of this rainfall, it doesn't affect the flow in the main Nile. And the challenge is to get this done. So we know what to do, we know how to do it. These are quite simple and straightforward technologies that are proven in many parts of the world, but farmers simply don't do it, they don't adopt them. And I think the reason has to do with economics. Farm gate prices are too low, and they don't provide the incentives for good land management, for investments in soil conservation, and for investments in supplementary irrigation. So agricultural transformation will depend on improving the economic viability of smallholders. And this has nothing to do with the Nile waters. It all has to do with creating an environment where it makes financial sense for smallholders to make better use of land and water resources. It will require an active role by governments. Obviously, the private sector is very important. It's the prime driver of agricultural modernization, but governments also play a critical role. They need to provide investments in rural infrastructure and electrification, but they also have to regulate markets and come up with a system that ensures these fair farm gate prices. Another thing we need to mention are the very high food losses. We don't have figures, but food losses are estimated at 50% from harvest to household. And this represents a huge waste of scarce water. And moreover, it also reduces the profitability of agriculture. And we've just seen that it's this profitability that is an obstacle to agriculture modernization. So reducing food losses across the board is a no-regret measure, but also it's something in which all the Nile countries can work together. So are we heading towards an inevitable water and food crisis in the Nile Basin? And I would say no. There are still lots of options, there's still lots of ways to improve water productivity and agricultural productivity, but there's clearly no silver bullet. Interventions are needed across the board, and they need to be properly timed and sequenced. What is important is that many of these interventions are outside the water sector. That is promising, so that we don't really need a lot of extra water. What is worrying is the lack of progress in realizing these options. The improvements that we are seeing are actually going very slow, and I would say they're going too slow. And this concludes my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention.